Welcome to the 28th episode of Speaking of Poetry. I am Rennie McQuilkin, publisher of Antrim House Books, whose authors are featured in this series. I am delighted to be joined today by Jane D'Arista. In addition to her work as a poet, Jane has served as an economist for the U.S. Congress and writes and lectures on domestic and international finance. She lives and gardens in Haddam, Connecticut. Welcome to Speaking of Poetry, Jane D'Arista.
Thank you, Rennie. I am very honored to be part of this series, which I have watched before today and enjoyed enormously. And I want to thank Rennie not only for this invitation, but for being the world's best editor, an editor who really is invested in the work of his poets and who wants them to get to a place where they realize what they actually set out to do. In addition to that, of course, his contributions to poetry in Connecticut over many years and his own remarkable and beautiful poetry is such an asset. So I want to thank him for all of those things. I will be reading today from the book I published in March with Antrim House, which is called The Overgrown Copse. And the book was written, the poems in the book were written actually over a 20-year period when I was busy on another kind of enterprise in economics and writing for the drawer as best I could when I could. Eventually, I collected all these poems together, began to revise them, and made this book from them. So there are old poems, revised poems, new poems, etc. Many different issues and themes here, themes about nature and grief and loss, philosophical ruminations, etc. But I think in the book there is an underlying theme, which is memory, and that ties the book together. I'm going to begin with a poem that has to do with the beginning of memory, and it is about a very real episode that happened near my house in Haddam, Connecticut, with my grandson. And the title of the poem is Whalebone Cove. Whalebone Creek. Whalebone Cove is down from the house. And this is a little creek like so many that run into the Connecticut River. So one day we are out and we're walking with the children and we stop to see this phenomenal thing that happens occasionally in the spring, which is an infestation, if you will, of eels. Whalebone Creek, for Thomas. Eels. We crossed the road to see them spill into the pool at the base of the waterfall, to watch them writhe, massed together until pushed by the current toward the brackish cove beyond. I told your sister they would head into the warm Sargasso Sea to spawn and die, that an embedded memory would bring their young back to these cold waters and link the beginning and the end of their lives. Of course, that was more than you could understand. You were only 3. But, curious to see the eels, you bent too far and fell hard, head first, into roiling water. Your father shouted, lunged, grabbed your ankle, and pulled you out. How that dark plunge felt, you felt again in dreams, a recurring baptism into the beginning of memory. The second poem that I wish to read is the title poem of the book, The Overgrown Copse. And first of all, as my family has told me several times, I must explain what a copse is. It's an island of trees and bushes in the middle of a field, which is used by small animals and birds as a refuge from predators and from the heat, etc. What it's doing in this poem is behaving as though it were a metaphor for Eden. The subject of this poem is young love. It is my observation of my granddaughter falling in love for the first time, and of course, it rings changes on my own experience at the same age. So here we have a poem called The Overgrown Copse for Carolina. It is as if you had entered the shade of an overgrown copse at the edge of a sun-baked field. The contrast seems so great from then to now. Once there, the bird you hear singing is the sound of your own voice, rising to a note you had not known you had. Your eyes move like fingers, tracing the contours of a face. Fingers extend for the latching of hands. Beauty is there to astonish. You see another and feel you too are seen. You did not know one could enter Eden, but know now it's where you are. Then moving on with the idea of memory, and moving especially to a poem that deals with an important person in my life, my poetic mentor. I am going to read a poem called Seeing Muriel Again. The occasion for this was finding a photograph of Muriel Rukeyser in the 1997 New York Public Library desk diary celebrating women writers. I have to add that I was a very young student at the time, and I was Muriel's babysitter, and that is how we met. I turned the page at the end of September, and you were there. Not just your photograph, you, in a room I remember as white, dressed to go out, saying what we should eat, what read, and when I should turn out the light. You were the age you are in this picture. These are the same large hands, dimpled chin, eyes cast down and to the side. For a moment after all these years, I could hear your voice, your laugh, even recover that part of myself who thought she knew who you were and did not. The next year, when your wedding present came, a pair of crystal doorknobs, I felt the surprise you intended, remembered your delight in unique but simple things. In time, I saw what I could not see before, your readiness to commit each day to creating a life. It stays with me now as I reach the final frame of memory where you take your purse, kiss your son, smile, and close the door, performing again that trick you had of emptying a room. The next poem, Projection, is a somewhat old poem. At least the notes for it were old, and it was then revised. It came at a time when I was looking through imagination for an insight, which I think poets often do. And as you'll see at the end of the poem, that imagining actually was rewarded. Projection. I see a woman in a field somewhere, in the only place she will ever know. In a world so large, her coming and going leave fewer traces than the melting snow. She moves now and lifts her head. Hers is not what is called a plummet-measured face. She limps, favoring some wound, and has a wall eye. Crossing the field to the river, she kneels to drink. Her bent body suddenly seems flawless, its beauty drawn from the life it holds. If the wild poppies in this field were stirred by a breeze, would what I see and smell be the same if I were she? I cannot know. There's a difference, a distance required for the tenderness I feel for her, that I want felt for me. The next poem is again about memory, yes, but it's also about grief. and a loss, a very serious loss. It's called Wonder. In Perugia that September, taking refuge from the midday sun, we stepped into a medieval world in shadow beyond an open door. There, gradually, regaining sight, we could see the ancient beams, marvel at the way a vaulted ceiling made the space above seem so large. I felt the same astonished pleasure as a child in another dark place, an orange grove, hugging the shores of a lake, low-vaulted and dense with hanging fruit. Emerging from its canopy on a December night to stand beneath the open sky, I was held fast by the infinity of stars scattered throughout the high, crowded dome beneath which the earth is placed. Moments when being moves beyond self can never be conjured. Their magic requires the trigger of surprise. I saw such a moment again, saw it come into your face when you waved me away as I tried to help and gave yourself to what it took to go. The next two poems that I want to read are somewhat philosophical in their orientation, and they're also extremely feminist poems. In fact, the first one I would say is almost a feminist rant. It's called Meditation, King's College Chapel, Cambridge. And I have to say that King's College Chapel, this beautiful, beautiful place, is just on the cusp of the Renaissance. And in comes Henry VIII and sets right in the middle of it a choir screen in English oak filled with his initials and those of Anne Boleyn. It is just totally out of place and not very pretty, but it may indeed symbolize the change in the English church that was taking place at the time very well. So, Meditation, King's College Chapel, Cambridge. Standing in an inverted nave, afloat in the arc of heaven, where fanned columns extend the reach of aspiration, soaring above the choir screen Henry placed to mark the ground of his passion for Anne. I think of that lost lady, and many more before and after, who could not walk behind that gate, confined by barriers of custom, compliant to the purposes for which their bodies were made. Scorned, jealously held as possessions, idealized, infantilized, to increase and control their value, reviled as breeders of death, disease, and daughters, begrudged their equal share in generation, their voice in inheritance. Even queens bowed in this holy space, diminished by fear, by the anger and disappointment of those who blame injustice on divine fate, accusing God to excuse the worlds of pain they make. And now as then the organ sounds, ending our earthly meditations, calling us to stand, to be present, to join in a solemn act of communal remembrance that celebrates the giving of the gift for which this vaulted nave was made. I step aside, ready to leave, but hungry for more, not for retribution or ending injustices in which I too comply. I want the promise of mercy, want it now, an end to exile, Eden restored, for all the right to know the worth of their creation. The next very feminist poem is called Message for Augustine, and it comes out of a reading of a short biography of St. Augustine by Gary Wills. In it, the story is told of Augustine's father advising him as a very young man to take a concubine. the story of their living together, and then the trip to Milan, where Augustine becomes very serious about his vocation as a Christian and sends the concubine back to North Africa. The poem is an imagined letter that she wrote, and it reflects, I guess, my concern in all of the storytelling, both by Wills and based on Augustine himself, that her name is never given. I was surprised you were here, near the house where you sent me to stay, walking with those who follow you now. Always before, I was told you were coming and could hide. Now that you are known, I am known and know myself as Augustine's abandoned concubine, the fig, they say, you picked when ripe and tossed aside to dry. Believing you would think I sought you out, I turned away, hiding from what you could not help but show. Our life is gone from your life. These days, those days we lived together so easily, you kissing my arm, tasting the salt that has excited you. Is that memory gone? Will I never again see my face cradled in the softness of your eye? They say you are changed by love for God, drained of self, dead to the life I have had no wish to survive. But isn't it selfish to think the past is yours alone? To assume that I, like our son, have passed from this world. As you see, I remain, me, one who only wants to hear you say the name I sign. Say it. The next poem is a very local one for me, and it deals with the nuclear power plant at Haddam Neck. That power plant is no longer there. It was dismantled, but when I made the notes for this poem, it was still there, and I decided not to change that when I revised it. Mist rises from the river. A small dome protrudes through trees. A secular temple, silent, abandoned, guarding the soured prize of knowledge. Today, the site of an accident, small, contained. Downriver, the hands of a woman clipping phlox reach through scattered butterflies. Crickets sound the bell of August, calling in a summer overripe, weighed with trophies of fertility. A woman in a garden she has made, nurturing life that ends in death, as will the life she received and passes on. She too fulfills a seasonal span in the covenant with time. She fears that covenant could now be broken, the forbidden fruit eaten, the old expulsion become a prophecy. She thinks it is only now we can lose the garden we were given. Turning to a more happy thought and scene, I'd like to read a poem that is dedicated to my daughter, who has always been a reader of my work and an enthusiast, and who actually also loves moonlight. So this is a poem called Ashland in Moonlight. The moon gains power as she moves into darkness. Here she sits outside the urban ring of light, softening the night. A house in shadow, a garden at rest from its work with the sun. My hands immobile, marbled against the rail. Shapes blur, change their size, altered by eyes that fail or strain to recognize. Like the wise virgin, the moon times her watch. She rises slowly, passing the slower stars. The world below, disarmed by her subtle command, lets go the urge to define, the effort to explain, succumbs to her knowledge of being, to become what will remain. And I, like many before me, many more yet to come, slip into her orbit, fall in with her pace, standing on a porch in the moonlight. I would now like to read a poem that is not in this book, but is new, so new that it was revised yesterday. And it comes from, the title of the poem is The Poem of the Act of the Mind. And it comes from a poem, the last line of a poem by Wallace Stevens, that he wrote the year before he died in 1954. The title of that poem is Of Modern Poetry. The Poem of the Act of the Mind. The blank page demands an act of the mind, words to form fragments of meaning, like the first pieces of a puzzle, the scent of a peach, the color of clouds when they move in front of the moon, what someone said, a secret you want to tell, but how? How do we link these fragments to make a poem? And how do we know what a poem should be? Like the light of stars traveling a great distance to arrive long after the journey began, understanding flickers and dims, its timing uncertain, its origin obscure. Yet when it makes a poem, the mind seems to reach an invisible plane, a place somewhere outside itself it did not know was there. A poem that is very appropriate for where I am in life now, and wasn't when it was originally drafted, is called Old Woman in the Morning. What calls her now that she is old, draws her from dreams of stories already told. Taut, as if strung between posts, she waits to be sounded by the slide of a bow, vibrating to the measure of her will. A slower beat, a minor key, a frayed score marked andante, an interlude, she knows, before what she fears, some raucous note struck randomly at the close. And finally, I would like to read a poem that goes back to my childhood and my memory, and it's called Finding a Field. This is about my life in northern Florida and what that world was like in some way. She had never walked that road before. It turned in an arc around a field, fenced with posts and loose strands of loosed wire, barbed wire. For cows, she thought, no longer there. Just a faint dirt track through a scrubby pine near her great-aunt Ida's house in Callahan, where the families that farmed raised chickens, kept a hog, a cow, and a patch of corn. The field's freshness seemed out of place. Tall grass of a different green, flecked with buttercups, daisies, and Queen Anne's lace. Small insects rode up and down on a breeze, their flat song a steady beat where the flowers swayed, seemed to say, this is the way a field should be. She grew, moved away, never went back, never knew if the field survived the lava-like spread of the city. The way it had been remained in her mind, possessed, even when forgotten, part of what she saved and took with her. And the companion poem from my childhood is called The Name of What Was There. And it is a contrast between the world in which my father grew up and the world in which I was living at the time of the event described in this poem as a young kindergarten child who was doing the usual things that suburban children do in contemporary America of that day. The name of what was there. Flowers are killed by frost, they said. Falling leaves foretell the dying of the year. But dying meant nothing to me until that fall, when we went back to the farm where my father was born to see men kill what we took home to eat. They had been working long before we came, laughing, hoarse from shouting, voices drowned by the roar of the fire. A boy no bigger than I watched women heap plates with food and pass them around. The men ate and returned to the yard again and again, clubbing the heads of squealing hogs in the pen, stringing them up belly bare against the barn. My father put me on his shoulders, lifting me up to see their throats slit. I saw and heard all I could understand, inhaled the odor of sweat, burning wood, and the sweetness of blood, with the cold night air. They seemed like clues to a riddle, as yet unsolved, the name of what was there. A final poem, because I am a New Englander now, is New England Spring. March freezes over once again, arresting the advance of a ragged procession formed in haste by a fitful tug of light. When April beckons, the standard-bearers cross into her terrain, reverse brown banners, and display new linings, stitched in muted tones of gold and green. Days lengthen, buds swell, twiggy lilacs turn to lace. Earth grows fragrant, pushing out life it sheltered from the cold. Warmth parades like the tawny red of a finch's breast, rising to his head like suppressed emotion. Suddenly, without warning, a field trots onto summer, defying the rule of the sun. And the sun, inching to the top of his measured climb, moves on, oblivious to the splendor he has spawned.
Thank you, Jane. You have created a glorious Eden for us, an overgrown copse of an Eden, replete with so much beauty and the figs and the figlessness, and of course the serpent, and of course we have undergone the expulsion therefrom. But what delights me is how well you have been able to push aside that whirling, flaming sword the cherubim holds to keep us out, and have allowed us to re-enter that paradise and to experience all of that beauty again. Thank you so much for doing that for us.
Thank you.
And also thanks to Ken Picard and Karen Handville, who make this program possible. If you would like to learn more about Jane D'Arista's work and read samples from her book, please visit the Antrim House website, antrimhousebooks.com. You may also be interested in other Antrim House poets whose lives and works are described on the website. Goodbye until we meet again next month for the 29th installment of Speaking of Poetry.